Murder in the mountains. Uncover the sinister truth beneath the shadows. Hook. What if the mountain could call you? What if your soul was bound to its endless hunger forever? Join us on a chilling journey where the line between the living and the lost blurs. The darkness is waiting. Are you ready to face the mountain's call? The wind howled through the narrow mountain pass, biting at her exposed skin. The dark, heavy clouds above swallowed the sky, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. Alice gripped the straps of her backpack tightly, her breath shallow and quick. Every step she took echoed off the jagged cliffs around her. Her boots crunched against the gravel, each sound magnified in the stillness. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. It pressed against her, making it harder to breathe. Her heart raced. She glanced around, but the landscape seemed endless, barren. No sign of life, no signs of civilization for miles. The only company was the rustling of the wind, the whisper of distant trees swaying. She'd come here to hike, to escape the chaos of city life. But now, every part of her wanted to turn back, to run. But there was something, a strange pull deep inside, telling her to keep moving forward. The path narrowed, and the rocks began to grow steeper, their sharp edges gleaming under the faint light that slipped through the thick clouds. And then there it was, the unmistakable scent of something metallic like iron or copper. Blood. Her pace quickened instinctively, but her feet were heavy. She wanted to stop, to turn away, but she couldn't. It was like something was drawing her in, urging her on. Up ahead, the path veered to the right, where a large boulder sat, casting a shadow on the ground. Alice hesitated, feeling a cold chill run down her spine. The scent of blood grew stronger. She took a slow step forward. Her eyes darted over the rocks, and then she saw it. A figure, a body. It lay crumpled on the ground, face down, surrounded by a pool of dark red. The faint, bitter taste of bile rose in her throat. She froze, her body stiffening. Her mind raced. Was this a hiker? Or something else? She forced herself to move closer, stepping carefully around the rocks. The body had no pack, no sign of struggle, but something wasn't right. A feeling deep in her gut told her that, whoever this was, they hadn't fallen by accident. Something had happened here, and Alice, now caught between terror and curiosity, couldn't help but look closer. The moment her foot landed on a loose stone, the sharp crack echoed through the silence, and then a voice, low, grating, "Don't move." Her blood ran cold. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Her heart hammered in her chest. "Who's there?" she whispered, her throat dry. There was no answer, just the sound of the wind and the distant crackling of trees bending under the pressure. She slowly turned, her eyes scanning every dark corner of the mountainside. Nothing. The air felt heavier now, suffocating, thick with anticipation. She couldn't see the source of the voice, but she knew it was close. Her fingers trembled as they gripped the strap of her backpack tighter. The body at her feet seemed more lifeless now, more distant. Her gaze lingered for a moment too long, and then something made her snap her attention back to the shadows. The voice again. "Don't come any closer." This time it was a harsh whisper, a warning, but there was no one in sight. She was sure of it. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to step back. Her foot hit a sharp stone, sending a cascade of rocks tumbling down the cliffside. The sound was deafening. But then, just as quickly, the mountain returned to its eerie quiet. Alice's breath quickened, panic creeping in. She knew she should run, but her feet wouldn't obey. Her body moved forward of its own accord. Another rustle, and then her blood froze. A figure cloaked in shadows stood just at the edge of her peripheral vision. She spun around. Nothing. Only the wind howling. But she could feel it now. The presence. Watching. Her body tensed, every nerve on fire. She turned back toward the body, but the pool of blood was spreading. Too much. Too quickly. The figure was gone. And then, from the far end of the mountain path, a shape emerged, slowly creeping toward her. Her heart stopped. It wasn't human. The twisted, elongated limbs, growing longer with every step, were barely visible in the darkness. It came closer, closer still. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure moved silently, its shape shifting in the shadows like something not quite human. A chill crawled up Alice's spine, her legs frozen in place. It was tall, impossibly tall, its arms stretched at odd angles, like branches from an ancient tree. The air around it was colder, the wind now stilled, as if even nature itself feared this thing. Alice's pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to run, but her body refused. She couldn't tear her eyes away. The creature's face, if you could even call it that, was a blur, like it had no real features at all, just a hollow, dark void where eyes should be. Closer, closer. It came. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the cold biting at her skin. But it wasn't just the cold that made her shiver. It was the sheer wrongness of it all. Something ancient, something far older than the mountains themselves. The figure's limbs bent unnaturally, its hands twitching, as if it was preparing to pounce. Her heart slammed painfully against her ribcage. Leave. The voice rasped, no longer just a whisper but a groan of deep, ancient sorrow. Alice didn't know what it wanted. Didn't know if it was warning her or threatening her. But the terror gnawing at her stomach told her that if she stayed, if she didn't leave now, it would be too late. She stepped back, one foot slipping on the rocks, sending a jagged stone tumbling down the cliff. The sound reverberated in the silence, louder than ever. The creature stopped, its head tilting slightly, as if considering her. Then it began to move again slowly. But this time it wasn't walking. It was crawling, dragging itself across the rocks like a thing long dead, its body contorting, limbs snapping into impossible angles. Every motion made Alice's skin crawl. It was getting closer and closer. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to turn, to run. She didn't look back. She couldn't. But her mind was screaming, warning her that no matter how fast she ran, it would follow. It always followed. Her breath came in frantic bursts, each step pounding against the ground, as if the very earth was trying to hold her back. The path beneath her feet seemed to shift, narrowing, twisting, as though the mountains themselves were conspiring against her. The wind returned, howling in her ears, but it felt different now. The air was thick, heavy with dread, pressing in on her chest. She couldn't outrun it. She knew that. But still, her legs pumped, each stride a desperate push to escape the creeping terror that followed. A screech, like nails on stone, pierced the air behind her. Her heart lurched. It was closer. Too close. Alice's mind was a blur. A single thought repeating over and over. Asterisk, get away. Get away. Get away, asterisk. The path sloped downward, steep and uneven. She stumbled, her foot catching on a rock, sending her crashing to the ground. Pain shot through her knee, but she pushed herself up, not daring to waste a second. The creature was there. She didn't see it at first, just the sensation of something watching. Something moving in the dark, just at the edge of her vision. Her breath caught in her throat, and she spun, just in time to see the silhouette lunge from the shadows. A grotesque shape, its limbs snapping and twisting with unnatural speed. It came at her like a shadow, swift, relentless, and terrifying. Alice scrambled to her feet, her body screaming for rest. But there was no time. The creature was upon her. Its cold fingers brushed against her arm, a jolt of freezing pain racing through her skin. She gasped, jerking away, but its grip was like iron. She felt the weight of its presence, its cold, suffocating touch, and for a moment, she thought it might drag her into the darkness forever. But then nothing. The grip loosened. She stumbled forward, barely managing to catch her breath, her mind a frantic blur. The path ahead, she could see it now. A sharp turn, a break in the mountainside that led to a sheer drop. Her eyes locked onto it. If she could just make it there. She sprinted, the ground beneath her trembling with each step, the world around her spinning as she raced toward the cliff's edge. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she pushed harder, faster. The creature wasn't far behind. Its breath was like a rasp, echoing in the air, sending waves of panic through her. It was gaining fast. She didn't dare look back. The cliff was closer, just a few more feet. Then, the ground beneath her feet gave way. She screamed. Her body hurtled forward, the dark abyss yawning before her. And then, a hand gripped her wrist. Not the creature, a human hand. She barely had time to register the shape before she was yanked backward with a force that almost tore her arm from its socket. For a split second, she thought she was safe. But then, the figure she had barely seen before stepped into the dim light, and her world shattered. The figure loomed over her, its face partially hidden in the shadows, but its grip on her wrist was ironclad. Alice's heart raced, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Was this another creature? Another twisted thing from the depths of the mountain? Or was it someone else? She tried to pull away, but the hand didn't budge. The force behind it was too strong, too terrifying. "Don't fight it," the voice rasped, rough and hoarse, but unmistakably human. She froze. The hand released her wrist, but only to steady her as she swayed on unsteady feet. She glanced up at the figure, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. It was a man, but not like any man she had ever seen. His face was gaunt, pale, with deep-set eyes that glinted unnaturally in the dim light. His clothes were torn, as if he'd been lost here for weeks, maybe months. His wild hair framed his face like a halo of madness. "You're alive," she gasped, the words barely leaving her lips. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. Yes, but not for much longer. The creature, whatever it was still out there, just beyond the edge of the cliffs. Alice could feel its presence like a shadow stretching across the land. Her skin prickled. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What is that thing? Why is it chasing me?" The man's eyes flickered to the shadows, and a grim expression passed over his face. "It's not chasing you. It's watching you. It's waiting. Waiting." Alice felt the blood drain from her face. Waiting for what? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out over the darkened valley, as if seeing something far beyond the mountains. "Waiting for you to make a choice," he said softly, his voice carrying an unsettling calmness. Her mind raced. A choice? What choice? "Look," the man continued, his hand gesturing to the precipice. "The only way off this mountain is to either outrun it or—" He trailed off, his eyes narrowing in something close to regret. "Or embrace what you're running from." Alice's stomach twisted. Embrace it? What does that even mean? The man didn't reply. Instead, he gave a knowing look, one that seemed to carry centuries of torment, of souls lost and never found. The wind howled again, louder this time, but this time it wasn't just the wind. The distant scream, the groaning of something not quite human, reached Alice's ears. It was drawing closer. She could feel it. The man glanced at her sharply. "You don't have much time." Alice turned to face the abyss ahead of her. The creature, asterisk at asterisk, was out there, stalking her every move. She didn't know what choice she had, what choice she could even make, and yet, in the deepest part of her soul, She knew. Her heart pounded, the mountain pressing in from all sides, the creature waiting in the shadows, and the man beside her, watching. Alice took a deep breath. The choice was hers. The choice would always be hers. And the clock was ticking. The air felt heavy, thick with uncertainty, as Alice stood at the edge of the cliff, her body trembling. The man beside her was motionless, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as though he knew the mountain better than anyone could. The wind howled again, and in the distance she heard the unmistakable rustle of movement, quick, deliberate, and unnatural. It was coming closer. Her chest tightened. "What do you mean by embrace it?" she asked again, her voice barely more than a whisper, but loud enough for the man to hear. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze flickered to the shadows beneath the cliff, then back to her. "You've already felt it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice softer now. The pull. The presence that waits. She didn't answer, but she knew exactly what he meant. That sensation, that dread, it wasn't just a creature, it was something more. Something ancient. Her mind swirled with fear, but also with a strange curiosity. She glanced over at the man. "What happens if I embrace it?" His lips tightened, as if he'd been forced to ask the same question 100 times before. "You join it," he said, his voice low. "You become part of it, or it consumes you." A chill ran through Alice, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the shadows that shifted ever closer. It felt like the mountain itself was alive, breathing, watching her every movement. "And if I run—" Her voice cracked as she spoke the words. The man's face darkened. "You'll die." His answer was blunt. No hope, no chance, just a cold, unwavering certainty. Alice swallowed hard. She couldn't feel her legs anymore. Her body had gone numb, as if the weight of the decision ahead was too much for her to bear. The distant howl of the creature echoed louder now, a bone-chilling sound that sent a tremor down her spine. The mountain seemed to be closing in on her, every shadow lengthening, every whisper of the wind feeling like a threat. "What should I do?" Alice asked, the words escaping her throat without her consent. The man turned his eyes to her, dark and knowing. "You already know the answer." A long silence stretched between them. Her heart raced, but her thoughts were a tangled mess. And then it hit her. The choice wasn't between running or embracing it. It was something deeper, something darker. She wasn't just a part of this mountain. She was part of something much bigger, something that had been watching her for longer than she realized. Her thoughts whirled, spinning faster, until one horrifying truth broke through. This mountain wasn't just a place. It was a prison, and she wasn't meant to leave. She was meant to stay. The ground beneath her feet shifted. The air stilled. And then the figure appeared, the creature. But this time it was no longer just a shadow. It was standing right in front of her. Its features were clearer now, no longer a blur, but a twisted, horrifying form. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something in between, a grotesque mockery of life. It reached out long, spindly fingers stretching toward her. Her pulse raced, a mixture of fear and something else, something she couldn't explain. The man beside her didn't move. He watched. And Alice. Alice realized something in that moment. The choice wasn't hers anymore. It never had been. The creature's fingers brushed against her skin, cold and alien. But this time there was no fear. There was only a strange acceptance. The mountain had won. And Alice. Alice had joined it. The creature's touch was colder than ice, sending a jolt of numbness through Alice's body. But she didn't pull away. In fact, she felt something shift inside her, as if a part of her had been awakened. Something ancient, something dark. She stared into the creature's eyes, or what passed for eyes, hollow, black voids that seemed to stretch forever, pulling her in deeper. There was no fear now, only a strange sense of calm. Her thoughts, her worries, her past, they all began to fade far away, like a shadow in the distance. His presence no longer mattered. Nothing mattered except the overwhelming pull of the creature's touch. The mountain seemed to exhale a slow, deep breath, and Alice felt it in her bones. The ground beneath her feet rumbled, as if the earth itself was acknowledging her transformation. She blinked, and the world around her shifted. The sky, once dark and threatening, was now a swirling mass of deep purples and reds, the air thick with a strange, oppressive energy. The cliff edge she stood on had vanished, replaced by a vast, endless void, an abyss that stretched out before her. The creature was still there, its long fingers wrapped around her arm, its presence like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. But now it wasn't just a creature. It was a guide, a force, pulling her deeper into the mountain's heart. "You belong here," the creature whispered, its voice rasping like the wind through dead trees. "You always have." Her mind screamed, "No, this isn't me. I can't, asterisk." But the scream was swallowed, drowned by the cold presence within her. Her body was no longer hers to control, her will submerged beneath something far stronger, far older. The man, he was still watching, but his expression was different now. No longer filled with regret or warning. Instead, there was a faint glimmer of recognition in his eyes. "Welcome to the fold," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind that had begun to swirl around them. "You're one of us now." Alice tried to speak, to shout, to fight it, but her mouth wouldn't move. Her body was no longer hers. She was trapped in her own skin, a prisoner to whatever dark force had taken hold of her. The creature tightened its grip on her arm, pulling her forward. "You will learn," it whispered, its voice like the crackling of old leaves. "You will become part of this mountain. You will remember the forgotten, and you will see the things that have always been hidden from your kind." The darkness around them deepened. The once familiar world now felt alien, an endless expanse of twisting shadows and cold, unyielding stone. And then, in a split second, Alice understood. The mountain wasn't just a place, it was a living thing, a being, a prison and a sanctuary, both at once. It had drawn her in, had called to her in a way she couldn't explain, and now it had claimed her. She had joined the fold, and now there would be no escape. The man beside her, the one who had once been so lost, now looked at her with a strange, hollow smile, a smile that held no warmth, only the chilling certainty of one who had long ago accepted the inevitable. Alice felt her heartbeat slow, her thoughts dulling. She could feel the ancient power coursing through her veins, the pull of the mountain taking root in her very soul. And then, as if a veil had been lifted, she saw it, the dark, twisting path that led deeper into the heart of the mountain, the path that no one ever left, the path that, once entered, claimed every soul that dared to tread it. Alice stepped forward, her feet moving without thought, her body now an extension of the mountain's will. She was no longer Alice. She was something else, something far older, and in that moment, as the wind howled around her, she realized that the mountain had won. It always did. The ground beneath her feet felt different now, solid, unyielding. It was no longer just earth. It was part of her. She was part of it. The shadows around her thickened, twisting into shapes that flickered and writhed like living things. The air hummed with a deep, vibrating energy, a pulse that resonated within her chest, making her feel as if she were breathing in the very essence of the mountain itself. Alice's thoughts were no longer her own. They were being reshaped, molded by the ancient force that had claimed her. Her mind, once filled with confusion and fear, now felt clear, coldly clear, as if she had always known this would happen, as if she had always belonged here. She felt the presence of others, shadows moving in the periphery of her vision. figures that seemed to drift in and out of existence, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. These were the ones who had come before her, the ones who had been lost to the mountain long ago. Their faces were twisted with something that was both sorrow and peace. They were like her now, part of the mountain, part of the fold. They had no true form, no true identity. They were simply echoes, faint memories of those who had once been alive. One of the figures stepped forward, its presence drawing Alice's attention. It was a woman, her features blurred, almost translucent, but her eyes were filled with understanding. "You will learn," the woman whispered, her voice a strange mix of comfort and despair. "You will remember what we were and what we have become." The woman's figure flickered, as if her very essence were dissolving into the shadows. But her eyes remained locked on Alice's. "We are the mountain now," she said, the words reverberating in Alice's mind. "We are the forgotten, the lost, and you will carry that burden with you forever." Alice felt a shudder run through her, a coldness settling deep within her bones. The weight of the woman's words pressed down on her, heavier than the mountain itself. But she knew there was no turning back. She was no longer the person she had been. She was something else entirely, something darker, something eternal. The creature, the one that had brought her here, was still beside her, watching her with those hollow eyes. It gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if confirming something important. Alice felt its approval, its acceptance, flowing through her like a current. "You're one of us now," it murmured, its voice a low, guttural sound that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. "The mountain has claimed you." Alice didn't answer. She couldn't. She didn't need to. The pull was too strong. The path ahead, an endless descent into the heart of the mountain, was waiting for her. Without a word, she began to move, her feet guided by something beyond her control. The others followed, their forms flickering in and out of the shadows, their eyes all fixed on her, all waiting for her to lead them deeper. The air grew colder as they descended, the stone walls pressing in tighter with each step. The ground beneath her feet began to shift, the path narrowing, twisting into a labyrinth of dark, oppressive tunnels. She didn't question it. There was no reason to. She was no longer Alice. She was part of the fold now, and she would walk this path, deeper into the mountain forevermore. The mountain had claimed her, and the mountain always gets what it wants. The further Alice walked, the more the darkness seemed to envelope her. It was no longer just a lack of light. It was a presence, a force that pressed against her chest, making each breath harder to take. The walls of the mountain seemed to close in around her, their cold, jagged surfaces reaching out as if they had minds of their own. The figures that followed her, those who had come before, moved with eerie silence. Their faces, once blurred and indistinct, were now becoming clearer, their features more defined, though still devoid of life. They were phantoms, echoes of those who had fallen into the mountain's grip. Their eyes, though empty of anything human, still carried a faint spark of something ancient, something endless. Alice could feel their gazes on her, their silent judgments weighing her down with every step she took. She was part of them now, a part of this eternal, living prison. As she descended deeper into the mountain, the air grew colder still. It felt as though the very stone was alive, its surface pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The path twisted and turned, leading her down into the abyss, farther from the world she had known. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of her footsteps echoing through the narrow corridors. There were no sounds of wildlife, no signs of the outside world, just the oppressive quiet, like the mountain was swallowing everything whole. It wasn't until they reached a cavern, a vast, hollow space that stretched endlessly in every direction, that Alice realized what had happened. The cavern was filled with an eerie light not from any natural source, but from the walls themselves. The stone shimmered with a sickly, pale glow, as though the mountain itself was breathing, exhaling its ancient power. In the center of the cavern stood a massive, twisted structure, something that looked like a throne, but made entirely of dark stone, veins of red running through it like blood. It radiated power, a dark energy that made Alice's skin crawl. The figures stopped before it, kneeling silently on the cold stone floor. Alice stood in front of them, feeling the weight of their gazes on her. She knew what was expected of her. Her heart beat in slow, measured thuds, her body moving without thought, as if it had been preordained, as if the mountain had guided her here for this very moment. She walked toward the throne, her steps echoing in the vast emptiness. The creature, the one that had brought her here, watched from the shadows, its hollow eyes never leaving her. It was waiting, just as the others were, for Alice to make the final, inevitable choice. She reached the throne, her hand instinctively reaching out toward it. The stone was cold, slick under her touch, but as soon as her fingers made contact, she felt a surge of energy ripple through her body. It was a force unlike anything she had ever known, filling her mind with visions, with memories not her own. Memories of the mountain, of those who had come before, of the countless souls who had been consumed by its hunger. She understood now. The mountain was alive, a sentient, all-consuming force that devoured those foolish enough to enter its domain. And it didn't just take their lives, it took their essence, their souls, and trapped them within its stone walls forever. The throne wasn't just a seat. It was a vessel, a conduit for the mountain's power, and it was waiting for her to claim it, to sit and become one with it completely. There was no fear now, no hesitation. The mountain had claimed her, and now she would claim the throne. Her fingers gripped the cold stone tighter, and as she sank into the throne, the mountain's power surged through her, filling her with a sensation that was both terrifying and intoxicating. She could feel the weight of the centuries pressing down on her, the countless souls that had been lost to the mountain, the voices whispering in the dark, urging her to take her place among them. And she did. As she settled into the throne, her body became one with the stone, her soul merging with the mountain's ancient heart. The shadows around her thickened, and the figures kneeling before her stood, their eyes now glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. They were no longer mere echoes. They were part of her, part of the mountain. She was the mountain, and she would never leave. The moment Alice settled into the throne, the entire cavern seemed to breathe with her. The stone around her pulsed, alive with an energy that was both exhilarating and suffocating. She could feel the weight of the mountain's power settling into her bones, filling every corner of her being, merging with her essence until there was no distinction between herself and the stone that surrounded her. Alice wasn't just a part of the mountain now. She was the mountain. The whispers began, faint at first, like a distant murmur, but growing louder with every passing second. They weren't voices of the living. They were the voices of those who had been lost, swallowed by the mountain's endless hunger. Their voices were filled with pain, with longing, and with something darker, something that Alice couldn't quite grasp. She closed her eyes, letting the sound of the whispers wash over her. Their words were incoherent, overlapping, their meanings twisting into one another. But beneath it all, one phrase began to rise above the rest. Asterisk, asterisk, embrace it. Asterisk, asterisk. Her heart began to beat in rhythm with the pulse of the mountain. Her senses stretched beyond the cavern, beyond the throne, reaching into the deepest recesses of the earth. She could feel the weight of the stone, the pressure of the layers above her, and the endless vastness of the mountain stretching down into the abyss. She was becoming something more, something eternal. The figures surrounding her, those who had followed her here, rose to their feet, their eyes glowing brighter now, their forms becoming more solid, more distinct. They no longer moved like phantoms. They moved with purpose, with a unity that filled Alice with a cold understanding. They were the mountain's servants, its guardians, and they had been waiting for her, waiting for the one who would take the throne and join the fold completely. As the last whisper faded into silence, Alice felt something shift inside her. The power she had embraced was no longer just a force, it was a purpose. She had become the mountain's heart, its will, its reason for existing. She understood now. The mountain was not just a place. It was a living entity, and it had a hunger that could never be satisfied. She had become its eternal caretaker, its keeper. The figures before her bowed, their heads lowering in reverence. Alice didn't speak. There was no need. Her very presence was enough. They understood. She understood. The cavern seemed to expand, the shadows growing darker, deeper. The whispers, now clearer and more distinct, began to echo through the stone walls. Asterisk, asterisk, welcome home. Asterisk, asterisk. The words reverberated through the cavern, through Alice, until they seemed to belong to her as much as they belonged to the mountain. She opened her eyes, and for the first time, she saw the truth of the mountain, its soul, its essence, flowing through the stone around her. The mountain wasn't just an entity. It was an extension of her now, and she was its extension. The path she had taken to get here, the fear she had felt, the uncertainty, it was all a distant memory now. She no longer cared about what had been. She was no longer Alice. She was something far more ancient, far more powerful. She was part of the mountain's eternal hunger. And as the figures stepped forward, their hands reaching out to her in reverence, Alice knew without a doubt that she was the mountain now, forever. Asterisk, asterisk, you will rule alongside us. Asterisk, asterisk. The voice was familiar, the tone almost comforting. It was the creature, the one who had brought her here, the one who had led her down this path. Now, it was more than a guide. It was an ally, a part of the fold that she had joined. Together, they would remain in the mountain forever, watching, waiting. The mountain's hunger would never be satisfied, but it would always have a new soul to feed on, a new heart to beat in its endless depths. And Alice would never leave. She was the mountain now. The stone beneath Alice seemed to pulse with an even greater rhythm, as if the entire mountain were resonating with her presence. The echoes of the voices, the whispers of the lost, began to meld together into a single, unbroken chorus. A chorus of those who had been swallowed, of those who had chosen to become one with the mountain. She felt the pull deeper now, as if every heartbeat of the mountain was now her own, every shift of the earth, every crack in the stone, every faint tremor in the deep. The mountain's hunger had become hers. Her body had merged with it completely, her essence now intertwined with the dark heart of the mountain. The figures around her, those who had come before, moved forward, their hands still outstretched. Their faces were filled with an unspoken reverence, as if they understood something that Alice herself had just begun to fully comprehend. They were no longer bound by the physical world. They had transcended it, become part of the mountain's endless cycle. Their eyes glowed, reflecting an ancient wisdom. As they knelt before her, the cavern seemed to close in, the walls pulling inward with a strange, magnetic force. The air thickened, swirling with the weight of time, as if the very fabric of reality was bending around them. The whispers grew louder, their words unintelligible but heavy with meaning. Alice stood unmoving as the creature, her guide, her companion, approached her. Its shape, once a dark silhouette, now seemed to form more clearly. She could see its twisted, elongated features, its black eyes glowing with an unholy light. The creature was not just a harbinger. It was part of the mountain, too. It was a force of nature, a fragment of the eternal hunger that pulsed through the stone. "You are the heart now," it whispered, its voice a low, raspy echo. You are the keeper of the fold." The words settled into Alice's mind like a weight, filling her with an unspoken truth. The mountain had chosen her, and she had chosen to stay. There was no turning back. Her life, her past, had been swallowed by this place, and in return, she had gained power, a dark, infinite power. But that power came with a price. The mountain's hunger was insatiable. It demanded sacrifice, and the sacrifice was always the same: the soul, Alice's soul. As she looked down at her hands, she realized with a chilling certainty that she had already given it up. There was nothing left of the person she had been. She was an extension of the mountain now, its will and its hunger. The weight of the past was gone, replaced with an emptiness that she could neither escape nor regret. The figures around her began to rise, one by one. Their faces were now clearer than before, their eyes filled with an endless, hollow longing. They were part of her now, just as she was part of them. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if every action was weighed by an ancient inevitability. The creature that had guided her leaned in close, its cold breath brushing against her ear. "It's time," it whispered. "You must take your place among us. You must become the ruler. You will lead the others." Alice nodded, though the motion felt strange, foreign. It wasn't her making the decision. It was the mountain. Without another word, the figures around her began to move, encircling her, joining their energy with hers. The stone beneath her feet seemed to tremble, the power of the fold growing stronger. Alice could feel the transformation, the melding of souls, the weight of eternity pressing down on her, and she embraced it. There was no longer a line between her and the mountain. There was no longer a barrier between her and the voices that whispered endlessly in the dark. She was the mountain now. The throne was no longer just a seat. It was a symbol of her dominion, the heart of the mountain itself, where all its power and hunger flowed through her. And with that, she understood. The mountain was more than a place. It was a force, a living entity that demanded to be fed with the souls of those who dared to enter its depths. And Alice was its keeper, its ruler, its endless hunger. As the last figure knelt before her, the mountain's power surged, a wave of darkness that spread throughout the cavern. The walls seemed to come alive, the stones stretching out like veins through the earth, connecting them all, binding them together. For Alice, there was no escape. There was no need for escape. She was home. And the mountain. The mountain was her now. The cavern pulsed with an eerie rhythmic thrum, as though the entire mountain were exhaling in time with Alice's new heartbeat. She felt the energy raw, ancient, coursing through her, intertwining with the very essence of her being. It wasn't just her body that had transformed. Her mind, her soul. Her very existence was bound to the mountain now, tethered to its endless hunger. The figures that surrounded her, once mere shadows in the dark, now stood as towering, spectral beings, their eyes glowing brighter with each passing second. They were no longer just echoes. They were the mountain's will, made manifest in this place. And Alice was their queen. She could feel their gaze upon her, the weight of their collective presence pressing down on her with every breath. There was no fear in their eyes, no hesitation, only an endless reverence. "You are the ruler now," the creature beside her said again, its voice barely more than a rasping whisper, but it carried a weight that seemed to shake the very walls of the cavern. "The mountain has chosen you." Alice didn't need to speak. She could feel the truth of the words, deep within the core of her being. She had been chosen not just by the mountain, but by the fold itself. She was no longer Alice. She was something far more ancient, far more powerful. The mountain had no beginning, no end. It was an eternal cycle, always feeding, always consuming, always changing. And now she was its center, its heart. The whispers of the lost began again, But this time, they were different. They were no longer just voices from the past. They were her voices now. Memories that had once been buried deep within her. Memories of those who had come before. They spoke to her, calling out in a language she now understood. Asterisk embrace it, ruler. Feed the hunger. You are the mountain asterisk. The power surged again, and Alice felt herself sink deeper into the throne, into the stone, into the very soul of the mountain. The cavern seemed to expand, stretching out in all directions, the darkness creeping in from every corner, eager to consume. She could feel the hunger, the endless need for souls, for energy, for life. And she understood. She wasn't just the ruler. She was the vessel. She was the one who would feed the mountain, who would keep the endless cycle of hunger alive. Every soul that wandered too close, every traveler lost in the mist, every wandering soul that came seeking the mountain's mystery, they would become part of her. She would draw them in, take their essence, and feed it to the mountain. And when she was no longer enough, when her power began to fade, another would come. Another would be chosen, and the cycle would continue. The figures around her bowed low, their eyes alight with a fierce, hungry glow. She knew what they wanted, what they needed. The mountain's hunger was never satisfied, but the figures, the servants, the souls who had become part of it, they knew their place. They knew that with Alice at the helm, the mountain's hunger would never be quenched. The feeding would continue. And so, as she sat in the throne, the weight of her new dominion pressing on her chest, Alice felt something inside her stir. A cold, dark force, ancient and powerful, slithered up from the depths of the mountain. It was a hunger. It was her hunger. And it would never end. Now, the creature whispered, its voice almost a caress. The mountain will rise. The earth will quake. And you will rule over all that comes. Alice nodded, her eyes glowing with the same dark light as the others. The mountain was alive with energy now, its hunger pressing outward, reaching into the world above, calling out to those who dared to venture too close. They would come, and when they did, Alice would be waiting. For the mountain, for the hunger. For eternity, the earth trembled beneath Alice's feet, a low, deep rumble that reverberated through her very bones. She could feel it, a shift, a tremor that signaled something more. The mountain was waking. The mountain was reaching, stretching out into the world above. Her senses sharpened, and for the first time, she could feel the pull of the outside world. The faint whispers of those who walked unaware, just beyond the mountain's dark grip. She could hear their thoughts, feel their presence from miles away. The mountain was calling them. It had begun its hunt again, its hunger insatiable, its thirst endless. Asterisk, asterisk, they are coming, asterisk, asterisk. The creature's voice came from beside her, low and raspy. Alice didn't need to look at it. She knew what it meant. The mountain had reached out, like an invisible hand, a dark force pulling them in. They would be drawn to the mountain, unaware of the fate that awaited them. The whispers around her intensified, voices overlapping in a cacophony, each one filled with longing, with hunger, with the same insatiable need that now flowed through Alice's veins. She had become part of this never-ending cycle, a keeper of the lost, a ruler of the fold. Asterisk, asterisk, it is time. Alice, asterisk, asterisk, the creature's voice echoed through her mind now, its presence looming behind her. Asterisk, asterisk, the fold is ready for you to lead. Bring them in. Feed the hunger. Let the mountain grow stronger. Asterisk, asterisk. Her hand rested against the cold, smooth stone of the throne, and for the briefest of moments, she felt a flicker of what once was. A memory of a life outside these walls, outside the mountain's grasp. But it was fleeting, a ghost of something long gone. She was no longer Alice. She was a part of the mountain, its will, its hunger. The mountain called again. Its voice was now a constant hum, beneath her skin, urging her forward. It wanted her to guide them, to lead them deeper into its depths. The souls that came, the ones lost to the mountain's call, they were hers to claim, to feed to the fold. Alice's eyes glowed with that same unnatural light, her mind completely focused on the path ahead. The mountain had been waiting, and now it was time to fulfill its endless hunger. Asterisk, asterisk, go, asterisk, asterisk. The creature's voice broke the silence, urging her. The first will arrive soon. Alice rose from the throne, her movements slow, deliberate, as if the very weight of the mountain's power was guiding her steps. The figures around her stood in unison, their glowing eyes watching her every move. They were ready, waiting to follow her, to serve her in this eternal cycle. The walls of the cavern seemed to shift, opening into a dark tunnel that stretched far ahead. It was a path that would lead her deeper, further into the mountain's heart. She could feel the pulse of it, the heartbeat of the mountain, urging her forward. And then she heard it, the distant sound of footsteps. A lone traveler, perhaps, drawn in by the mountain's siren call, unaware of the darkness that awaited. Alice felt her heart quicken with the anticipation of what was to come. The first of many, the mountain was stirring, its hunger awakening, and Alice was ready to feed it. With each step she took, the walls of the tunnel seemed to shift, pulling her closer to the surface, to the world above. The call of the mountain grew louder, the whispers more urgent. The traveler would soon be in its reach, and when they crossed that threshold, Alice would be there. She would guide them, bring them to the fold. They would be part of the mountain, just as she had become. The hunger would be fed, the mountain would grow, and Alice would remain its queen forever. As she stepped into the light of the tunnel's opening, she smiled, the dark gleam in her eyes reflecting the power she now held. The mountain had claimed her, and she would claim it all. The light of the outside world felt faint, distant, as Alice stood at the threshold. The wind whispered softly around her, carrying with it the scent of the trees and the earth above. The very world she had once known, now so far removed. The mountain, though, felt like home. It was where she belonged now, where she had always belonged. Ahead, she could see the lone figure, a traveler, moving cautiously along the rugged path that wound its way toward the mountain's shadow. Their footsteps were tentative, unsure, but the mountain's call was undeniable. It pulled at them, just as it had once pulled Alice. Her heart thrummed in her chest, not with fear, but with a cold, dark anticipation. She could already feel the mountain stirring within her, its hunger awakening as the traveler drew closer. The figures that followed her, the fold, watched in silence, their glowing eyes fixed on the approaching soul. The mountain was reaching out, and Alice, its queen, was the one who would lead it to its next feast. The traveler was unaware, their head down as they trekked toward the mountain's base. They had no idea what awaited them, no idea that their steps were carrying them into the depths of a place that would consume them. Alice's gaze sharpened, her senses heightened. She could feel the pulse of the mountain growing stronger, the earth beneath her feet trembling in response. It wanted them, wanted their soul, and Alice would be the one to deliver them. Without a word, she stepped forward, her footsteps silent against the stone. The wind had died, leaving an oppressive stillness in its wake. The travelers' steps faltered as they lifted their head, sensing something, or perhaps someone, lurking just beyond their line of sight. But it was too late. Alice was already there. The travelers' eyes locked with hers, and for a brief moment, they seemed to understand. A flicker of fear flashed across their face, but it was too late to turn back. The mountain had already claimed them, just as it had claimed Alice. With a slow, deliberate motion, Alice extended her hand, her fingers reaching out as the power of the mountain flowed through her. The air grew thick with tension, and the ground trembled as if the earth itself was drawing the traveler in, pulling them toward the fold. The travelers stumbled forward, their body rigid with fear, their mind unable to comprehend what was happening. But Alice knew. The mountain knew. With a swift motion, Alice touched the traveler's forehead, and in that instant, the connection was made. She felt the surge of life, the rush of energy, as the mountain consumed them, absorbing their soul, their essence. The traveler's body went limp, their eyes wide with terror, but their spirit was already slipping away, becoming part of the fold, part of the mountain. Alice closed her eyes, savoring the feeling of the power coursing through her. It was like a feast, the rush of energy flooding her veins, filling the empty spaces inside her. The hunger was satisfied, for now, but she knew it would not last long. The traveler was gone, but their soul was now part of the mountain, bound forever to its endless hunger. Alice stood over their lifeless form, her heart calm, her mind focused. The fold had gained another. The mountain had grown, and as she turned back toward the dark entrance, the whispers began again. Louder this time, the voices of the lost, the souls who had come before, now united in a single, endless chorus. Asterisk, more will come, asterisk, the creature beside her murmured, its voice as low as the wind. Asterisk, the hunger will never cease. You will never be alone, asterisk. Alice nodded, feeling the truth of those words deep within her. She had chosen this path. She was the ruler now, the mountain's queen. And as the wind whispered around her, carrying the scent of the world above, she knew with certainty that the hunger would always be there. Always. She would never leave. The mountain had claimed her, and it would never let her go. The air around Alice grew thick, heavy with the pulse of the mountain's hunger, its power, its endless need. She stood there at the edge of the cavern, feeling the tremors deep beneath her feet, the slow, relentless movement of the earth as it responded to her call. The whispers surged once more, louder, sharper now, their frantic tones like the cries of the lost, the wandering souls who were soon to be claimed. Her gaze swept over the figures in the fold, and they nodded, their eyes glimmering with a dark, unspoken understanding. They were waiting, eager for the next soul to be drawn in, eager to feed the hunger that would never be sated. The ground rumbled again, but this time it wasn't just the mountain that was stirring. Alice felt the presence of the approaching wanderers, the ones who had been lured by the mountain's call. She could almost taste their fear, their confusion, drifting toward the shadow of the mountain, oblivious to the fate that awaited them. They were drawn to the mountain's mystery, to the ancient, untouched silence that surrounded it. The mountain was a siren song, and Alice was its voice. Her heart began to beat faster. She could feel their souls nearing, their warmth like a distant flicker against the cold, unfeeling stone. She could see them in her mind's eye now, two travelers a pair, walking toward the mountain's entrance. They were hesitant, their steps uncertain, but the pull was too strong. The mountain had already begun to take root in their thoughts, its hunger already gnawing at the edges of their minds. Alice took a step forward, her hand raised in a silent command. The fold responded instantly, their forms moving in unison as if they were one being, one entity with a singular purpose. They were ready, prepared to welcome the lost souls into the fold, to feed the mountain's endless hunger. The wind shifted, and Alice felt the cold brush of it against her skin. She turned, eyes narrowing. They were closer now, just at the foot of the mountain, on the verge of crossing into the darkness. Their footsteps faltered, and Alice could almost hear their thoughts, the doubt that gnawed at them. But the mountain would guide them. The mountain had already claimed them. They could never escape. She whispered a command, her voice like a caress, but it carried the weight of the mountain's power. Come. The figure in the distance hesitated, glancing around, feeling the unseen pull, sensing something wrong in the air. The other traveler, seemingly oblivious, continued walking toward the cavern's entrance. And then, just as Alice had willed it, the darkness surged. A tremor rolled through the earth, and the mountain's power rose like a tide, swallowing the light. The air thickened, and in an instant, the travelers were no longer on solid ground. The cavern opened before them like the maw of some great beast, pulling them in, wrapping them in shadows. Their cries were muffled by the stone, their struggle useless against the mountain's grip. Alice felt their souls as they crossed the threshold, a sharp, electrifying pulse of energy that coursed through her. They were here now, lost in the fold, part of the mountain's endless hunger. She could feel their fear, their confusion, but she knew it would soon fade. The mountain would take them, as it had taken so many before. With the travelers now within the fold, Alice allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had done it. Another sacrifice, another soul for the mountain. The hunger had been fed for now, but she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The mountain's appetite would never be satisfied. The fold around her grew restless, eager for more. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. The hunger was still there, waiting, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. Asterisk, asterisk, it will never end, asterisk, asterisk. The creature's voice echoed in her mind, as if to remind her. The hunger will never cease. It is part of you now, and you will feed it forever. Alice didn't respond. She didn't need to. She could feel it in her bones, in every fiber of her being. The hunger, the mountain, the endless need, and she would feed it forever. She would never leave. Not now. Not ever. The fold was her family now, and the mountain was her home. She was its queen, its keeper, and she would never be alone. The lost would always come, and the hunger would always be fed. The mountain's pulse thrummed in time with Alice's own heartbeat, a steady, unyielding rhythm that echoed through her very being. She could feel the weight of eternity pressing down on her, on all of them. The fold, standing in the shadows, watching with eager, glowing eyes. The hunger had been sated for now, but Alice knew it was only a fleeting respite. She could feel it deep in her bones, the mountain's insatiable appetite, always lurking beneath the surface, waiting, hungry for more. The travelers' souls, now intertwined with the fold, had already begun to fade, lost in the dark depths of the mountain's power. But she could still feel them, the remnants of their lives, flickering like dying embers in her mind. Their fear, their confusion, their last moments of resistance. They were all part of the fold now. As Alice stood there, her fingers brushing against the stone, she felt the familiar pull of the mountain's power, tugging at her, reminding her of her purpose. The next ones would come soon. The mountain would never stop calling. It would never stop feeding. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, grounding herself in the darkness. The voices of the lost souls were all around her now, their whispers like a soft wind. They were always there, a constant presence, swirling around her, never far. And yet, there was a new sound among them, a distant crackling, as though the earth itself were shifting, changing. Alice opened her eyes. The fold, those who had been claimed before, were watching her now, waiting for her to guide them to the next feast. Their glowing eyes were full of a hunger, too, but it was different from the mountains. It was the hunger of souls who had become part of the endless cycle, never to be fully satisfied. The mountain began to rumble again, low and ominous. The ground trembled, the walls vibrating with the power that flowed beneath them. It was happening. The next ones were nearing. Alice felt the air grow colder, the tension building. The call of the mountain intensified. It could sense them, too. Another pair of wanderers. The cycle would begin anew. Her heart quickened with anticipation, but it wasn't fear. Not anymore. She was the queen now, the one who called the lost to the fold. The hunger, once a gnawing sensation, had become part of her, a constant reminder of her purpose. The wind howled through the cavern, carrying with it the scent of the world outside, the scent of life. But to Alice, it was just a faint memory, a distant echo of the world she had left behind. She turned toward the fold, her gaze sweeping over the figures that surrounded her. They stood in perfect formation, waiting. The whispers grew louder, but Alice silenced them with a single gesture. The fold knew what to do. They would stay in the shadows, feeding, waiting for the signal. And when the time came, Alice would call. She would lead them to their next feast. The rumble beneath her feet grew stronger. The earth shifted, and in the distance, Alice could hear the faintest sounds of movement. Footsteps, unsure and hesitant, growing nearer. Her heart stilled, and she closed her eyes, listening. The travelers were close now. The mountain had begun to reach out, stretching its invisible tendrils toward them, pulling them in. Asterisk, asterisk, come to us. Asterisk, asterisk, Alice whispered under her breath, her voice soft but commanding. The wind carried her words, spreading them across the mountain like a wave. The mountain calls you. And just like that, the ground trembled, the dark shadows of the cavern quivering as the mountain responded to her call. She felt their presence drawing nearer. Two souls lost, two lives about to become one with the fold. Alice didn't move. She watched, waited. The figures in the fold stirred, ready for the next offering. With a final surge of power, the mountain's pulse reverberated in Alice's chest, and the walls of the cavern seemed to close in around her. The travelers were nearly within reach. They would come, and when they did, the hunger would rise again. The fold would grow, and Alice would remain, as always, its queen. Forever the earth beneath Alice's feet trembled once more, but this time, it wasn't just the mountain that was shifting. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, an undeniable pull that stretched through the very fabric of the cavern, through the walls of the mountain itself. The souls within the fold stirred, their glowing eyes flickering in the darkness as they felt the mountain's hunger rising once again. Alice stood at the heart of it all, her pulse steady, her senses attuned to the pull of the mountain, to the arrival of the next souls who would feed its endless hunger. She could feel the air growing thick, as if the mountain were exhaling, calling, reaching. She had been the one to call the lost, but now it was the mountain itself that would draw them in. The distant sound of footsteps echoed through the cavern. Two figures, no more than shadows, were nearing. Alice didn't need to see them to know who they were. They were travelers, drawn to the mountain's call, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Her hand twitched, and the fold moved silently, like a wave of darkness shifting in the shadows. They were ready. The mountain's hunger flared. Alice could feel it deep within her, gnawing at her thoughts, at her very soul. It was the same hunger she had embraced when she had first crossed into the fold. The mountain had claimed her, just as it was now preparing to claim these souls. She raised her hand, a silent command, and the darkness surged forward, swallowing the light. The footsteps of the travelers grew louder, their breaths quickening, as if they were finally realizing the danger that awaited. But it was too late. They were already part of the fold. They were already claimed. The first of the two figures stepped into the cavern, eyes wide with realization, but it was too late. The mountain's grip was already on them. Alice could feel their soul, their fear, their resistance, but the mountain was stronger. The fold swarmed around them, as silent and swift as the darkness itself, pulling the travelers into its embrace. Alice closed her eyes, the power of the mountain rushing through her veins as she felt their souls slip away, becoming one with the hunger. The mountain would never stop calling. The hunger would never cease. Alice opened her eyes, her heart calm, her purpose clear. She was the mountain's queen. And the fold would never stop growing. The mountain stood silent once again, the echoes of the lost souls lingering in the air like a distant, mournful song. The hunger, for the moment, had been sated, though Alice knew it was but a fleeting lull. The earth beneath her feet had stilled, the tremors subsiding, leaving only the soft, rhythmic pulse of the mountain's heart. Alice gazed out over the cavern, the fold now settled in the shadows, their forms silent and unmoving. The glowing eyes that had once radiated hunger and anticipation were now dim, the power of their eternal bond with the mountain fading into stillness. For a brief moment, Alice stood alone at the center, surrounded by the ancient stone walls that had become her world. The whispers of the fold had quieted, the rush of energy that had once filled her veins now ebbing away like a tide retreating into the dark depths. She could still hear the distant echoes of the souls she had claimed, the travelers, the lost, now part of the mountain's eternal cycle. Their essence, their fear, their lives had been consumed, bound forever to the hunger that flowed through her like blood. But Alice was different now. The weight of the mountain, the hunger, had become a part of her. She was no longer the woman who had once wandered, searching for answers. She was the queen of the fold, the keeper of the lost, and she had long since accepted the role the mountain had chosen for her. As she took a deep breath, the mountain's pulse seemed to slow, as though recognizing her acceptance. The power that had once surged through her now felt like a gentle hum, a constant companion that she would carry for as long as the mountain stood. She turned toward the heart of the cavern, her steps echoing softly in the silence. The fold had retreated into the shadows, but Alice knew they were always there, waiting. The mountain would never stop calling. The hunger would never be truly satisfied. And as she walked toward the heart of the mountain, she understood. She was the mountain now, and the mountain was her forever.